Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
For the July 4th holiday, I'm Mark Golub, and how very lucky we all are to be citizens of the United States of America, the most noble social experiment in human history. And as Jews, how extraordinary it's been to live in a country committed to the principle of freedom from religious persecution, an immigrant nation that has embraced the American Jew as a full and equal member of society, so that American Jewry as a whole has flourished, perhaps in ways unparalleled in our long, sometimes tortuous, glorious history, contributing in a myriad of ways to the dynamism and the character of this country, and which has seen the American Jewish community grow to become the center of the Jewish world, a critical factor in aid in the creation and stunning success of the State of Israel. Of course, nothing's perfect. For all its good, the United States is still a work in progress, and the openness of America has had its flip side for the American Jewish community, making assimilation easy and attractive, and a real challenge to the future of American Jewish life. And all this is what we'll be looking at on this special Roundtable edition of L'Chaim, and I am thrilled to be joined by a wonderful panel that will be sharing their perspectives on the Jewish experience in America. Let me introduce them to you. First, a gentleman who's been a staple and a fan favorite on L'Chaim since the program began in the 1970s, one of American Jewry's leading scholars in the field of American Jewish history, Dr. Jeffrey Gurock, Libby M. Clapperman Professor of American Jewish History at Yeshiva University. Another esteemed Jewish historian here in America, whom you've had the pleasure of seeing on JBS before, Dr. Deborah Dash Moore, the Frederick G.L. Hutwell Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. And we're also joined for this edition of Roundtable by two gentlemen who often share opinion on L'Chaim and who are each keen observers and analysts of American Jewish life. Stephen Bayme is the director of the Contemporary Life Department of the American Jewish Committee and of the AJC's Koppelman Institute on American Jewish-Israeli Relations. And Thane Rosenbaum, a distinguished fellow at NYU Law School, director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society housed at NYU, and a best-selling novelist and author. It is so wonderful for all of you to be joining us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Here we are, celebrating America, and I want to begin with you, Deborah.
How did I know? Ladies first.
As you look at the Jewish experience in America, what distinguishes it for you from Jewish life as it has developed in other cultures in other countries? You know, very often people talk about the golden age of Spain. As you look at America, what distinguishes Jewish life here?
Okay, so I'm not going to disappoint you, and I'm going to say that what distinguishes Jewish life in the United States are the opportunities available to Jewish women. Jewish women have become truly equal members, not in every facet, but in most facets of Jewish life in the United States. And that has not happened elsewhere. It's unprecedented, and the changes that have occurred in Jewish religious life, the changes that have occurred in politics, the restructuring of family life, and the understanding of what relations should make for a family, and how to bring up kids, all of these things have changed dramatically because Jewish women have received an enormous amount of equality. Is there more work to be done? Yes, there's more work to be done. There's no question.
Okay, but it's interesting. That's where you would begin. The impact it's had on the American Jewish woman.
Yes,
Fabulous.
yes.
Jeffrey?
Increasingly, we look at the American Jewish experience, particularly the early portion of the American Jewish
Early
experience.
meaning when?
Well, the period before, let's say, the middle of the 19th century, as similar to the experience of Jews in other welcoming environments, what we call port cities or port countries. Such as Holland, such as England, such portions of France, where the emancipation of Jews, which is so much a part of our modern Jewish history, was more inadvertent than powerfully driven, and these Jews did quite well. Where the American experience is, I guess, more distinctive is that the vitality of the emancipation process, which never really happens here. If you look at all the great documents of American freedom, you'll never see the word Jew mentioned. And we are not a major problem in many instances to the host society. Now, if you look at New York City, my home city, and the dialect that I speak, you will know that Catholics in this city, in this state of New York, have much greater difficulty gaining their freedom than Jews did. So the fact that we are here early and early accepted helps us thrive as a community.
Lovely. Steve? How wonderful has it been for the American Jewish community, and what in your mind distinguishes it from other times in Jewish history?
No society in diaspora Jewish history has provided as much leeway for collective Jewish politics. In other words, Jews become masters of their own destiny because America provides such a wide berth on which they can play ball, so to speak. That's a testimony to American pluralism, that there is no single model of being an American. American society basically tells Jews, do whatever you want to do, obviously within the limits of law, the parameters of law, but within those parameters, all doors are open to you. I'd say the last, just in recent decades, the 8 years of the Clinton administration, it's a very non-political, non-partisan statement, but the 8 years of the Clinton administration marked the collapse of any remaining barriers to Jewish participation.
And those barriers, for example, were?
Well, did we see, for example, a Jew in the cabinet, a committed Jew in the cabinet who was actively expressing himself as a Jew? Jews during the Clinton years were found on all levels of the administration. The administration stopped counting how many Jews it employed and really didn't care. Now, that to me was an incredible statement about America, that you are what you are, you're accepted for what you are, you'll be judged on your merits and not on the, to use Martin Luther King's phrase, the color of your skin or your ethnic base, your religious identity. So all those things to me have been tremendous blessings for the Jewish experience. And in turn, part of that pluralism has provided more options and choices for how Jews choose to express themselves as Jews. So that pluralism has been central to who we are as people, as committed Jews. So in that sense, I think there's so much to celebrate here, and I think it's wonderful that we set aside this kind of time for it.
That's lovely.
And if we look at the negative side of recent years in terms of the economic problems that America has faced post-Clinton, I think it's remarkable and gratifying that when America turned negatively in terms of the economy, it wasn't laid at the doorstep of Jews, which in prior situation actually was. Now, we've had some Jewish malefactors, to be sure, who've done bad things to Jews, and that's an issue which we as a community must deal with. But the fact remains that during the recession, it wasn't called a Jewish recession like it was during the Great Depression, going back in time to the other panics, as they were called, in the 19th and 20th century. So that really seconds what Steve said.
Absolutely. And nor did it happen during the oil embargo.
Exactly.
In the 1970s. You would have expected some real Jewish backlash and maybe some backlash on the State of Israel, and it didn't happen. And that was both surprising in a most wonderful way, and it affirmed some of the things that all of you have said.
If anything, by the way, just to add to that, Deborah's written beautifully on the Rosenberg case, where the American Jewish Committee was petrified that there'd be an anti-Jewish backlash. American society reacted with enormous fairness. The Rosenbergs were what they were, and they paid the price for it. The Jewish community did not.
Thane, I want your overall sense. What distinguishes for you the Jewish experience here in America, as compared to other epics of Jewish history?
Well, the first thing I can think of is that the Jewish Americans had really rose to the challenge of Thomas Jefferson's language in the Declaration of Independence. No ethnic group in the United States took as seriously the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit is an aggressive verb, and the idea was that there's opportunity. You know, John Locke said life, liberty, and property. Jefferson said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He had something in mind. By the way, there's still people who think that Alexander Hamilton was a Jew and that he started the banking industry. And so anyway, there's a lot of Wall Street here that's related.
Did well
to
on Broadway too.
and he's doing well on Broadway. But as far as Jefferson, one of our founders.
Oh, wait, Hamilton was not a Jew.
No, he wasn't.
No,
but there's
no,
still
no.
people who think that he was. But with respect to Jefferson, you know, the pursuit of happiness is very clear that he was thinking something beyond the other enlightened philosophers.
And is your point that the Jew has been happy?
I don't think that
No,
any
they've been in pursuit.
pursuit. Yes, I think that in pursuit of happy, that's the problem. Of course, he never told us what happiness would be. But one of the things that people have defined it by is material gain, an opportunity that everyone would have to stand in the line and go chase down your happiness, pursue it in whichever form you define. When you think about the Jewish American experience, it's shocking, right? Every generation did better than the next. Jews spent the summers in sweltering Lower East Side. Then they went to the Catskills. Then they went to the Cape Cod. Then they went to Paris. Every generation did better for summers. Steve probably tracks this better than anybody, but I can't even imagine how many millions, certainly hundreds of thousands of people, ended up with PhDs and JDs and MBAs and PhDs. And so the idea of taking, which is, I think, goes beyond Jeff's point about freedom. There's emancipation, and then there's this true open playing field. And that speaks to a little what Steve said, that the idea that to be judged on the basis of merit. And even when Jews experienced, remember, they were saying, you know, literally get me out of the ghetto. We saw what it was like in Europe. We didn't like it in the Lower East Side. And if there's an opportunity to get out, we will get out. And so that they were real opportunists. And when you think about what the pursuit of happiness would be, they took opportunity seriously and pursued it zealously. And I think that I can't imagine any other ethnic group taking Jefferson more seriously.
Okay. Jeffrey, if you thought about moments of American Jewish history, what would be one or two? Give me a highlight.
Perhaps it is the letter that George Washington sends the Jews of Newport, which he cribs from a letter which the Jews of Newport sent to him. And the key phrase is he refers to Jews for the first time in our history as citizens. Now we're citizens of this country, and it's a country that does not subscribe to bigotry, et cetera, except as it applies to other minority groups, most notably African Americans during that time period. So a turning point moment may well be that particular statement of Jews as citizens.
That would be a highlight, would it not?
Works for me.
Okay. Deborah, give me a highlight. I don't care where it's from.
I would say that the Second World War was, for American Jews, a crucial moment. The opportunities that came with the draft and with enlisting, the chance to fight for the United States and at the same time to fight for the Jewish people, which was sort of seamlessly woven together in the minds of many of the men who were drafted. The very visible enemy that they were fighting against, that was an anti-Semitic enemy, that moment was crucial because it brought Jews into the center through their military service, and that military service then opened up a lot of what you're describing. It empowered Jews to
Very
fight for
interesting.
changes that subsequently came along. It opened up the colleges that had been closed. It was. I see that as a really critical.
Fascinating.
And that's
time.
such an irony, and that is the period 1939 to 1945 is perhaps the most horrible episode in our Jewish history.
That's correct.
Overall. But I've written about this, and I learned from Deborah on this, that World War II is a terrific time for American Jews, and she humbly left out the story of the USS Dorchester and its significance.
That's true.
Okay.
Tell the story.
So in February of 43, there's a large troop ship, the Dorchester, and is heading into the North Atlantic in an effort to avoid the German U-boats. It's has almost 900 men on board. And among the men who were on board were 4 chaplains. 2 of them were Protestant, one a liturgical Protestant, the other an evangelical Protestant. One was a Catholic, and the 4th one was a Jew, Alexander Good. The ship is torpedoed, and it goes down. And as it's going down, the 4 chaplains, they're on the upper decks because they're officers, decide to go down with the ship and to help as many of the men as they can. And that image of these 4 chaplains sort of linking arms, and each of them praying to their gods in 3 different languages, in Latin and in English and in Hebrew, became really symbolic of...
It became an iconic image.
Oh yeah, it became an iconic image.
It's Jewish Iwo Jima
Yeah.
in that respect.
Yeah.
And what they have in common is they're praying to the same God. They're reciting Psalms, which we have common together. And I'm always chagrined that I remember the name Alexander Goody, but I can't remember the names of the three Christians. But it's something we should remember and something we should celebrate. And although we're 2% of the population, 3% of the population, we're now talking about Protestant, Catholics, and Jews.
Yeah.
My goodness, how things change from just a few years earlier during a very difficult time for American Jews.
Yeah.
I want to tell you one more thing that occurs to me.
Yeah.
We had the Jewish war veterans.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, when you hear the stories of American troops liberating Nazi concentration camps,
Mm-hmm.
you hear about a Rabbi Schachter.
Mm-hmm.
You hear about other Jews who are part of the American army,
Mm-hmm.
who are in the forefront of liberating our people. There is something dramatic to me about that.
There's a wonderful video of a service that was held in Dachau, a Jewish service, and the chaplain there, Jewish chaplain, gets up, and it was videotaped by the Signal Corps, the U.S. Signal Corps. And he gets up and says he comes to you as a representative. I'm coming to you as a representative of the American, army and of the Jewish community in America. Well, that's a very powerful statement, although technically he's really only a representative of the American military, but he felt empowered, to
That's
say
a lovely
that.
story. That's
Yeah.
a lovely story.
I want to say a word about Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who
Please
was a
do.
dear friend, and I think a friend of Steve Thane's
Absolutely,
as well.
yeah.
He was in his early 20s, and he went up against someone named George Patton, who was General Patton. And all the stereotypes about Patton, well, many of them are true. And he had, to some extent, an anti-Semitic profile. And this young chaplain, an American Jew, son of immigrants, had the moxie to push Patton to help these Jews who he liberated. And that was one of his great contributions. So when you think about Jews feeling a sense of empowerment, belonging, etc., here's a man who will talk back to George Patton.
Okay, Thane, give me a highlight for you in the sweep of American Jewish history.
Well, I started off saying that Jews embraced the Declaration of Independence with the pursuit of happiness, but they also embraced, not necessarily volitionally, manifest destiny. The history of Jews in Europe and Russia is that they stayed in ghettos. They were in insular shtetls. In the United States, now some of this, as we know from reading Stephen Birmingham's Our Crowd, the German Jews of the late 19th century didn't want Polish Jews to live among them. They saw them as an inferior brand of Jews. But just imagine that all of a sudden Jews became, go west, young man. I mean, there were episodes of Bonanza where Jews were in them, right? I mean, there were the idea that
Every Western had Jews.
Yes, Gunsmoke had a Jew.
Wagon Train
Had a Jew. I think there was even a Jew in the Big Valley.
Have Gun Will Travel had a great Jewish
Yeah,
episode.
yeah. But this is funny to us, but it's true that
Not
Jews,
funny. It's profound.
Jews actually were on covered wagons, and we would not have Levi Strauss without Manifest Destiny. We wouldn't have Neiman Marcus without Manifest Destiny. All of this, I mean, why were Jews in Dallas? There's a reason for this. And you see Southern Jewish communities, Western Jewish communities, and it's largely, Leo Frank, right, is another example of a Brooklyn Jew who ends up in Atlanta. It doesn't end up well for him, but Jews moved in ways that we didn't really see, nor did they feel the need. Some of them were, at least in the United States, they seemed to be much more adventurous, and then they ended up building these substantial communities, like the Jewish community in San Francisco.
Interesting.
Was early, very much part of the
Alright.
Gold Rush.
Give me your highlight.
Well, perhaps
or
just
two.
one corrective for Thane. We should talk about Jews in television. It's a remarkable phenomenon. But the Jews who showed up on Gunsmoke and Wagon Train and Bonanza were not the Jews who actually went west. In other words, each one of those programs managed to depict Jews in much more traditional tones than the ones who actually went west.
I mean, there were more Jewish on those shows.
Much more, by far. Yeah.
There was a bar mitzvah on the Waltons.
Okay, that one I never saw. I would take an episode from somewhat later, May of '67. The atmospherics of May of '67 was in many ways echoes of the 1940s and the 1930s, the Holocaust. Daily threats to eliminate the Jewish state, the relative neutrality or silence of the liberal world. But American Jews react very differently from what had been their historical experience before. Just personally, I attended the demonstration in Washington right at the beginning of the Six-Day War. It was the largest Jewish demonstration in Washington up to that time, and probably since then as well. In 2002, there was one that rivaled it in terms of solidarity with Israel, but I'm still pretty sure the one in May of June of '67 exceeded in numbers. What was profound here was a political statement by American Jewry that we're ready for prime time. In other words, we're ready to assume global responsibilities. Obviously, it relates to the fact that we live in the global power that has the most responsibilities. But our willingness to assume those responsibilities spoke volumes for the maturation of American Jewry and how it saw itself and its responsibilities to Jews elsewhere. That presupposed a degree of Jewish self-confidence, a willingness to go down to Washington and advise the State Department what its policy should be, a willingness to place the collective welfare of the Jewish people above the individual welfare of what's best for Jews as individuals. To me, all those things are remarkable. And in many ways, I'd say the agenda of the Jewish community at large was radically transformed by the experience of May of '67. The difference, again, is that this time the Jews pulled it off, obviously not just by themselves, but in terms of America, but obviously in terms of what Israel was able to do. But Israel was able to push away an existential threat precisely because they did not stand alone in terms of world Jewry. They stood together shoulder to shoulder with a strong diaspora, a vibrant diaspora, at the centerpiece of which was here the United States.
Very interesting. By the way, you talk about marches in Washington. Are you referring at all to the march, the gathering, 200,000 Jews who came to protest on behalf of Soviet Jewry?
That's December of '87. That was 250,000, and that probably was the single largest one. Yeah, that exceeded the one of May of '67.
That was a highlight for me.
Absolutely,
Highlight.
but again, I would say that you could have that only after the experience of
Yes.
'67.
I
There's one
understand.
other piece, and Steve's right. '67 was a dicey moment in terms of American Jews, in terms of how they relate to the State Department, which has been always our antagonist, and American policy. As far as the Soviet Jewry movement is concerned, although there's tremendous vitality in terms of the turnout, in fact, for a while there was a secular holiday introduced in the Jewish calendar. It was called Solidarity Sunday, at least in this city, during the period between Passover and Shavuot, where people turned out in mass numbers to support Soviet Jewry. The difference was, and Steve can correct it because he's more attuned to contemporary issues than we are, at least I am, is no one in America ever questioned whether it was right or wrong to protest Soviet activity towards minorities. we're always on the side of America because they were the enemy, the Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union. As far as Israel is concerned, it was a very important turning point in terms of expressing where we stand, notwithstanding what other Americans or State Department officials would have said about our people. And of course, Solidarity Sunday was also a great moment for young Jewish men and women to meet one another. It had a social context as well, which should never be gainsaid on those types of things.
One small footnote here. On the first day of the Six-Day War, the State Department spokesman issued a statement of America is neutral in thought, word, and deed. That was actually quickly retracted by the Johnson presidency. But bear in mind that that statement reflected State Department thinking at that moment. It did not reflect the course of American policy. Why did American policy shift so strongly towards a pro-Israel position? At a minimum, you'd have to say it's about the role of Jews in American society, the influence that Jews express, the place of Jews inside the Johnson administration. All that is testimony to Jewish influence, power, and willingness to exert it at moments of crisis.
I wonder, though, whether Steve would agree that when you think about 1967 in May, the Jews had been so very much involved in civil rights era during just several years before of the
and anti-Vietnam
and anti-Vietnam, that there was sort of batting practice, so to speak.
Yeah, the atmosphere encouraged it. Absolutely.
Right, that they just had come off of. I mean, it was Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. Right, there was already a number of years in which Jews had their own sense of political activism, not on their own behalf. And I think that what Steve is talking about, this was very unique, that they were standing on behalf of their own.
For Jews.
For Jews. Prior to that, they were the creators of the NAACP. There was, actually, as you know, there were rifts between blacks and Jews, precisely because of the charges of paternalism among Jews. But Jews were very, invested in the civil rights struggle. In fact, the controversy about the movie Selma that came out a few years ago, that controversy was based on the fact that, where's Rabbi Heschel? Where are the Jews on the front row? How come we don't see any Jews linking arms? Jews felt very proud of their participation in that social movement. And by 1967, you can see that they were ready, they were energized to do it on behalf of their own people.
In some way, I hear you're saying that when you talk about Jewish highlights, it may not have to do with a specific moment in time, but a movement in the Jewish community. Is that fair to say? Because none of you gave me a march, but I think to myself, a highlight of Jewish life here is the extent to which, and you made reference to this, that Jewish pluralism has flourished. And so, I couldn't give you a date, but is the establishment of HUC in Cincinnati, JTS in New York, Yeshiva University in Washington Heights as a different kind of yeshiva, are these also highlights of American Jewish life?
Deborah said something before that reminded me of what she said about quotas and universities. The creation of Brandeis may have been not a yeshiva, but a public university that was established in part to avoid having Jews no longer being admitted into Harvard or Yale. That too was changing. But there was, even in education, Jews dominated CCNY, right? That became the Harvard for immigrants in New York City. And even the New School with many of the Frankfurt intellectuals that ended up there. But when you think about the creation of some of these schools, there's no question that Brandeis plays a part in this. By the way, the fact that Brandeis became a Supreme Court justice, the symbolism of that alone. But that might have been a movement as well to create, this was the Jewish Notre Dame.
My alma mater, CCNY, was a great gift to proletarian people, and Jews took advantage of this. And in return, we gave back to America 8 Nobel Prize winners. And one of the things you asked us before this show was to name some very important American Jews. The year 2000, this was done all over the country. And one of the names that came up more than any other name was Dr. Jonas Salk. People were always afraid of the scourge of polio. And he was a City College man, went for free to City College, and had difficulty getting to graduate school because some graduate schools were off limits to Jews, but he persevered. He wasn't a good speaker because otherwise he would have been a lawyer, which was his mother's goal, and he became the savior of American world children. Now, tragically today, in some third world countries, polio has come back, which is a tremendous tragedy. But when you think of City College's contribution, City College to Jews opened up a free school. When I went there in the 60s, we paid $37 a semester. That wasn't per credit, that was the whole nut. But there's a long history of City College, opened for the poor, and in return, poor people contribute back to America. So Jonas Salk may be the most important Jew of the 20th century.
Interesting. All three of you also pick up on that theme. What has been the contribution of specific Jewish Americans, and whom do you feel, are at the top of the list in terms of the quality and impact of their contribution? Steve?
Well, we've already alluded to Brandeis. The important thing about Brandeis, obviously, is his achievements as Supreme Court Justice are remarkable, and his opinions are read to this day. What's significant about him to me is this articulation of American Jewish pluralism. Namely, to be a committed Jew is to make one into a better American that expresses itself in support for Zionism. So Brandeis's legitimation of Zionism for the American Jewish community, in turn, also legitimates pluralism within American society and its expression of it. So I would put him at the very top of the list. At the bottom of the list, if you'll indulge me for a second, it's probably Theo Epstein. Why? Because he's the general manager of the Cubs. If the Cubs win the World Series this year, what he's already done for me is that he broke the 86-year-old curse on the Red Sox, going back to the sale of Babe Ruth in 2004 when the Red Sox did win the World Series. And he constructed the team from scratch. He's done the same now for the Cubs. If they do that, I wouldn't put him at the very top of the list, but I certainly would put him.
He makes it on the list.
He makes it on the list.
He makes
No
it.
question.
At the bottom of the list?
No. He makes the lower rung of the top
Well,
list.
I'm glad you believe in messianism. That's really wonderful.
Absolutely.
But can we just one before you can
Sure.
go back to Theo Epstein for a second? There's
Yeah.
a great anecdote with that, because actually I'm friends with his father and his sister.
Leslie Epstein, yeah.
The novelist Leslie
Right.
Epstein, who's the son of the Epstein twins that wrote Casablanca,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Amazing.
right?
By the way,
it's a good American
I was
story.
gonna
Great
do this
American
later.
story.
Yes.
And the son takes the Cubs, the Red Sox and the Cubs to the World Series.
I was going to do
Let's
this
get
later,
Steve.
but it fits in so well now. You use the way in which certain events in baseball, as it applies to how the World Series is scheduled, as a paradigm of the movement of the Jewish community. Do that, summarize that again for us, and then I'd love to hear the other three respond to it.
I've done this n number of times, but it's
know.
always worth repeating. In 1930s, the greatest Jewish baseball player of his day was Hank Greenberg. I mentioned to you that one of his great distinctions is that Gurock family tradition has that he played handball with my mother. Okay?
Everyone
With your
knows that,
mother?
Jeffrey.
My mother.
Oh,
my mother.
that's
my
good.
mother. That's right. Anyway,
She must have been a great player.
she was a great mother. That's for sure. In any event, the World Series is coming, and he's pressured by Detroit to play on the high holy days. He's pressured. And sports is a community-defining situation, and his manager, Mickey Cochran, says, you must play for your team. And he ends up playing on Rosh Hashanah. He doesn't play on Yom Kippur. Very fast. Fast forward to 1964. Greatest Jewish baseball player at the time is Sandy Koufax. The picture of him with me in my study at home. He does not play on Yom Kippur. Look how different the Jewish situation is from 38 to 1934 to 1964. And then we fast forward to 1986, the Bill Buckner World Series, Mr. Boston Red Sox fan.
Yep.
Before they qualify for the World Series, they have a game on Rosh Hashanah, and Jews of New York demand that the game themselves be canceled. Look how, and Peter Vesey writes a column where he says, God will intercede, there'll be great thunderstorms, and he advised fans to start building arks, like the biblical Noah. You can't make this up. Anyway, three models. Lack of acceptance. Detroit's a tough town for Jews. Henry Ford, the Ku Klux Klan, and others. 64, what you say, cultural pluralistic America, more accepting of Jews. And by 1986, Jews are empowered to say, listen, we own season tickets. We go to the games. Treat us the same way you treat Christians. Very different world. And again, this is not about sports. This is about
I
the
understand.
acceptance of Jews.
I love
Always
the
have to
par-
throw in that caveat.
Yeah, anyone want to
Yeah,
comment?
Steve, you had one last
Well, yeah, but
bottom of the list.
I do have another one near the top of the list, but let me comment on this. Perhaps three quick footnotes. First of all, Jeffrey, you forgive me, it was 1965 with Koufax, not
Thank you.
64. That's one footnote.
Senior moment.
64 was the Yankees and the Cardinals. 65 was the Dodgers and the Twins.
Right.
More seriously, though,
You
growing up...
wanted to note a World Series where the Yankees lost. I appreciate it.
Absolutely right. Yeah. More seriously, though, I saw the Koufax experience as one that it meant a great deal, specifically for non-Orthodox American Jews, my friends on the street. In other words, people who, largely speaking, were not particularly observant, but this idea that someone stood up and said, Sandy Koufax does not play in Yom Kippur. That meant a world of difference to the Jewish identity of relatively unobservant American Jews. And I think that was a remarkable experience. The contrast with 86, to put this, and this is the third footnote, the real problem with 86, aside from the classical ones that Jeffrey alludes to, is that that famous Game 6 was on a Jewish holiday. I believe it was Shmini Atzeret. Amazingly, talk about the Orthodox world, everyone in my shul knew exactly what happened. You know, it was like absolutely no mystery. They all figured it out long before the New York Times appeared the next day. How they did it, we can speculate, but it's an incredible statement about how sports has so motivated and so mobilized American Jewish consciousness on different levels.
Okay, Thane, you're a novelist.
I was hoping you'd go there.
It is amazing the contribution American Jews have made to American culture
They own
in
the 20th
all
century.
the arts.
They own it.
Talk about that for a moment.
I mean, where to start? Start with Henry Roth. Henry Roth's book, Call It Sleep, was reviewed, I believe, on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. If not the cover, one of the first few pages. An immigrant Jew raised on the Lower East Side ends up moving to Harlem, and he tells the story literally from the family of the Sherrill family, David Sherrill, from Ellis Island onto the Lower East Side. Many people compared it with James Joyce's Ulysses. It is, in many ways, the Jewish James Joyce's Ulysses. That really sort of sets out, this is a 1930s novel, that sets out Jewish literature, which if you really look at it, it's dominated the 20th century. First of all, there's the Holy Trinity of Saul Bellow, who winds up with a Nobel Prize in literature, the first American Jew. He may be the first Jewish person who won, I'm sure he is, the first Jewish person won, unless Emma Lazarus won one, which I don't believe so.
Isaac Bashevis Singer does win a Nobel Prize.
Many years
After.
later.
Right.
Many years later.
Exactly.
At least 15 years later.
Until
But see, that one is a trickier one because he wins it as the pioneer of Yiddish literature.
Yes, by the way, is he an American Jew? Would you call him Isaac Bashevis Singer?
Absolutely. His
Right.
career is made in the United States. He's in Playboy magazine in the United States. He's not in Playboy magazine in Warsaw. So there's no question he
Okay.
benefited greatly by being here. By the way, he benefited greatly by Saul Bellow's patronage. He was, Bellow, for a small little anecdote, the first to translate Singer. Gimple the Fool was translated by Saul Bellow for the Partisan Review. And had that not happened, it's not clear what would have happened. He could have been another Chaim Grada, another one of the Yiddish writers that weren't able to get translated. So, smaller anecdote, but yes, Bellow is a giant. Philip Roth, Bernard Malamud. In high culture, of course, Cynthia Ozick, Grace Paley, Stanley Elkins, Joseph Heller, Chaim Potok, for the first time in his first novel, The Chosen, we're introduced to the insular world of Hasidim who play baseball, right? How American could that be? Opening scene is
With Danny on the field.
Danny, right, smacking the ball and knocking out the Jewish pitcher, right? Right? I mean, how American can it be? But Hasidim, who, when they're not actually up at bat, are studying. Great image, right? They're in the dugout studying, and then they get up to bat, they hit the ball, they go sit down. Dominant in terms of the way both in the assimilated form, which is, the more intellectual, brainy Bellow, to the irreverent Philip Roth, where the beginnings of the self-hating Jewish literary person begins to take shape. To Joseph Roth. Then you see Stanley Elkins, and then even in lower brow culture, dominated Sidney Sheldon, Leon Uris, Herman Wouk, Howard Fast. I mean, just to give you a sense, they dominated the lists for decades. So in terms of Jewish contribution to literary culture, other than in the 1920s you saw Faulkner and Fitzgerald, after that it really is Jewish.
Fascinating. You want to do music at all?
Oh God, I'm going to give up. I know that you were going to say who's your favorite or the most important. I think it's Irving Berlin. I would have picked, if you would have said to me, who do you think is the one you picked? Who did you already pick?
I haven't picked
Oh,
yet.
I'm on record now on the show. I don't even think there's a question. I know that no one else probably would have picked him, but Irving Berlin. He wrote "God Bless America." He wrote all the Gentile songs from White Christmas to Easter Parade. He had 25, I think, Broadway shows that were, that sold out. Wrote scores, wrote films, never learned how to read or write music, by the way, and is America's most dominant songwriter, and gave it God Bless America.
Okay, so we have Irving Berlin.
But
we also have George Gershwin.
Yeah,
and we have
Gershwin,
all
but
the
you
people-
have, but the entire record industry,
Yes.
was sort of dominated by Jews throughout, that era.
You didn't mention Leonard Bernstein.
And of course, Leonard Bernstein, who we see at the New York Philharmonic. So you see, but
And Isaac Stern.
and Sondheim,
Yitzhak Perlman.
and Sondheim, right,
And Sondheim.
and the classical violinists that we've seen, right. So in many ways, musical culture, the American songbook from Berlin to Gershwin to not Cole Porter, but Oscars and Hammerstein,
Rogers.
Richard Rogers.
Right.
This is all
Jerome
Jewish.
Kern.
Jerome Kern. So, and of course, the people that wrote Fiddler on the Roof. That itself was another bellwether.
Bach and Harnick.
Steve and I have talked about this before, the contribution in the 1960s to what was at that time the longest running play on Broadway was Fiddler on the Roof. Think about that. That's a long time ago for this. All of a sudden, Americans who come from other parts of the country to see a show in Broadway are learning about the hora. Today everyone takes for granted. Everyone has been to a bar mitzvah and danced the hora. Everyone knows what a bagel looks like. But it's not clear how true that was in the mid-1960s when they came to how exotic and strange that must have looked.
So I got to tell you a story. So some Sunday afternoons in our home, we're watching the baseball game. My mother walks into the room, turns off the baseball game, and turns on Leonard Bernstein's Young People's Concert.
Sundays.
Sundays.
Right.
It better be Sundays
Yeah,
or I'm
right.
in trouble.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sundays.
In any event, so we can watch Leonard
Yeah.
Bernstein. Now, we were good children, so we watched the show, but this was broadcast all over America. You talk about a Jewish contribution in terms of high culture, music, teaching children all over the country. And if you saw the picture of the kids in the audience, they're all wearing ties and jackets. They're dressed very appropriately. And Leonard Bernstein is teaching America about sonatas, about operas, about all different types of things. An extraordinarily important person, and he's on that list as well.
That's lovely. All right, another factor of Jewish life in America is the proliferation of organizations meant to both defend the Jewish people and enhance Jewish life. And so there's the AJC, there's two AJCs. There's the ADL, then there's the President's Conference. And today, if you go through any kind of Jewish almanac of organizations, it's endless. Talk for a moment about the significance of the way in which the Jewish community of America organized itself in a way that, in a sense, took American Jewry to another level.
If the Jewish community is perhaps over-organized, has a good deal of duplication, never has there been a Jewish community in history that has had no less than 6 defense agencies. I think 2 is the maximum anywhere else. A lot can be said about that, and real questions about Jewish communal priorities should be raised. But behind it also is another message, namely that given the freedom that America has given, Jews have taken advantage of every opportunity to provide avenues, instruments by which they can master their own destiny, tend to their own needs, take care of their own people and constituents. That, to me, again, is a part of the greatness of America.
I agree 100%. All right, now talk to me for a moment about Judaism in America. You've written a lot about Orthodox Judaism in America. We've mentioned already that one of the uniquenesses and strengths of American Jewish life has been Jewish pluralism. I don't know if Jewish pluralism exists the way it exists in America anywhere else in the world. It is also a new phenomenon. You know, many Jews grow up thinking there was always Reform Jews and Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews, and it's not true. This is a modern phenomenon of the 19th and 20th century. In addition, you've written a lot about the spectrum within Orthodoxy. There is, for lack of a better phrase, there's mainstream Orthodoxy, there's Haredi Orthodoxy, there's Lubavitch Orthodoxy, and now there's modern open Orthodoxy. Speak for one moment about the significance of Jewish pluralism in the American Jewish experience, and why that too is part of the greatness of the American Jewish experience in America.
So I think I'm going to surprise you, because I'm going to conflate that question with the question of most significant and important Jew.
Okay.
As far to my way of thinking, the most important Jew in terms of the evolution of American Judaism in this country in the 20th century, is a former Orthodox Jew who became the founder of the Reconstructionist movement. That's Mordechai M. Kaplan. And I've written about Kaplan. I think about Kaplan very often. Any rabbi across the spectrum who talks about the importance of bringing Jews into the synagogue, into the sanctuary, through ancillary activities, whether it's the art room, the music room, the dance hall, the library, or God forbid, the gymnasium and the pool, is talking Kaplan's Torah whether they know it or not. In fact, one of the things that I've written about is that one of the ways you can define different segments of the Orthodox rabbinate is whether they affirm what I call the usable Kaplan as opposed to the unusable Kaplan from a theological point of view. Mm-hmm. So to my way of thinking, someone who starts out as an Orthodox rabbi and then has, later on in his life, he lives a long life, 102 years, has his Siddur burned by the Agudat HaRabbanim. To me, he's the most significant contributor to the evolution of American Judaism in the 20th century, mm-hmm. which may sound remarkable in light of your question about orthodoxy, but he's a hovering figure and awfully important.
The resurgence of orthodoxy in America, which is one of the dominant motifs of the late 20th century, you know, a movement that everyone thought was moribund in the 1950s, had no future, was bound to disappear. That resurgence of orthodoxy, whether Orthodox Jews appear to admit it or not, is testimony to the importance of religious pluralism for Judaism in America.
How so?
That it gives you the right to be different. When I was growing up in the 1960s, wearing a kippah in public, no, I didn't grow up in New York, I grew up in Boston. Wearing kippah, right, exactly.
Sorry.
Wearing it in Boston was relatively unheard of.
Of course.
Today it's de rigueur, not just in Boston, but virtually every major city around the country. Number two is that Orthodox ideology sets you very much at odds with prevailing currents of American intellectual culture. Biblical criticism probably is one of the expressions of that, but by no means the only one. Yet American society, by dint of legitimating religious pluralism, basically says, irrespective of whether I agree with your theology or not, I respect you for the right to express it. So in that sense, religious pluralism has been, I would say, an unmitigated boon for American Orthodoxy. Ironically, the very same people who deny religious pluralism for others, or deny the value of it, but it's been tremendous value for American Orthodoxy.
Yeah, you can look at Chabad and the mitzvah mobiles and the other efforts to bring, you know, religious ritual out into the cities and public spaces as drawing upon what the Salvation Army was doing back in the 19th century when they were holding prayer meetings on the streets of cities. So the notion that this is public space and you can go out and attempt to recruit. They're not interested in converting everybody. They're interested in converting other Jews. But still, that it's part of the American urban scene.
Okay.
And I study silly things like alternate side of the street parking and meters and the use of meters. And very quickly, my wife and I made a shiva call in Borough Park recently. We noticed that it said that the parking meters were on 9 a.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday and Sunday. In other words, your car gets a day of rest. Now, this has to do,
As
That's
opposed to Sunday.
as opposed to Sunday, right?
right.
This has to do with the appropriate and redefined use of political power. There was a time where Jews didn't want to say there's a Jewish
Yes,
vote,
yes.
but in Brooklyn, during the reign of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, it was impossible for a political figure to run for office in the city, black, white, or otherwise, not to get a dollar bill and have a picture taken with a Lubavitcher Rebbe. These people know how to use the political system for their own benefit, and I say that not pejoratively, and it's a different way of defining Jewish identity.
Okay, I want to come back one more time, the idea of Jewish pluralism. Because although, yes, there has been a resurgence, I'm not sure yet what the numbers are going to show, but there is some kind of reawakening of interest in Orthodoxy, and not necessarily open Orthodoxy, but sort of mainstream Orthodoxy. If you look at Jewish life from the end of the 19th century through certainly the first 3/4 of the 20th century, what you have is an entirely new, different approach to experience of Judaism, where people come from Europe, and they come basically from traditional observant homes, and they want to find a mechanism by which they can be modern and American and still Jewish. And they do it initially in two different ways. From within the Reform movement, it's almost like we want to be just like the non-Jew, to the extent even that there will be certain synagogues that move Shabbat from Saturday to Sunday. And they're the Germanic Jew that, they're in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they're at Temple Emmanuel in New York. And then there becomes another wave of European Jewry, which doesn't want to look or act like a Protestant. At the same time, they want to feel they're part of the modern world. And they still want to be part of Jewish observance. And they create the conservative movement. And so you have Isaac Mayer Wise, and you have the Hebrew Union College the Hebrew Union College at that time. You got Stephen Wise creating the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. Ultimately, they merge. And then you've got JTS, which through the 50s and early 60s is the preeminent Jewish institution of America. That's where that's where Kaplan and Heschel both are. That is where the wellspring of a totally different approach to how are you both observant and you critique the Torah and you critique the Bible, and Torah Sinai has a slightly different meaning. And even in Reform Judaism, especially in the second part of the 20th century, there's an evolution there where it becomes more of a traditional expression of non-Orthodoxy. And this becomes taken for granted by American Jews. And yet if you go to Israel at the moment, there's a fight to try to create a Jewish pluralism in the state of Israel. If you go to Great Britain, it's not the same. You go to France, it's not the same. And that one of the most unique contributions that American Jewish life has created is a model. By the way, it may only work here. Maybe it only works because of the pluralism you've talked about overall. But the reality is, most American Jews should appreciate the extent to which our pluralistic approach to Judaism is new, unique, and remains unique in the overall Jewish world.
I would say that much of what you've described is really true and is an important feature of what makes for difference in the United States. One would hope that this kind of democratic religious pluralism, lowercase d.
Which, by the way, comes back to the very first thing you started with.
Yes.
The egalitarian movement of Judaism starts with Jewish pluralism. It doesn't start within the Orthodox world. It starts within the Reformed Jewish community. It spreads to the conservative Jewish community. Mordechai Kaplan is the first Jew to have a bat mitzvah ceremony because he only has daughters. And that also
Judith Kaplan has the first bat mitzvah. She's the bat.
Yes.
Yes, she's a celebrant, right.
Yes, but it's because her father says, okay, I have a son. If I don't have a son, I have a daughter. You'll be treated the exact same way. And it's interesting. A generation later, David Hartman, who begins as an Orthodox rabbi, moves to modern Orthodoxy, then rejects Orthodoxy. He wants to be some kind of pan-Jew. Okay. He's got problems with his daughter at the beginning, and ultimately, she teaches him what it means to be an egalitarian Jew. The very first thing you said was the most important contribution from your perspective, is a product of the unique Jewish pluralism of American Jewish life.
Oh, yes, that's true. Along with the opportunities that are available in the United States. I mean, Kaplan's decision to create a bat mitzvah grows out in part of the fact that women have won the right to vote in
Yes.
1920, right? I mean, that's an important, larger...
It's part of a larger picture.
Right, part of a larger picture.
Yes.
And he was a believer that you could bring the American and the Jewish together in positive ways.
And by the way, it continues, because now the issue is, how do you include, the issue of inclusion, the gay Jewish community? Not only in non-Orthodox life, but in Orthodox life as well. All of this is being driven by a Jewish experience that I believe is unique to the United States and the Jewish experience here.
What we should not forget, and Thane alluded to it earlier, is the issue of separation of church and state. When de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America in the 1830s, one of the symbols of American uniqueness for him was the fact that there was no established church, which in turn, he argued, actually protects religion because it makes religious expression free and independent and conserves the conscience of the state, critiques state policy, something which, for example, was forbidden in France at the time, where he was coming from. In that respect, separation of church and state has politically meant a far more assertive Jewish community, but it's also meant the expression of religious pluralistic ideology by dint of the fact there is no single model.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So that's one thing we should not lose sight of. And if anything, we talk about being grateful. The fact that America has insisted on the separation of church and state is, I think, one of the most critical things we can say about America. It gets into some of the debates today about should there be governmental aid to parochial day
Correct.
schools, and that's an important question.
It's a different issue.
But don't forget the principle involved here, that separation of church and state protects religious expression and encourages it. Contrast that with Israel, where there is no separation.
Yeah.
You have an existing Orthodox monopoly, certainly over laws of personal status. You have a chief rabbinate, where, again, nothing in the Torah mandates a chief rabbinate. It's entirely an institution that was developed which entrenches that orthodoxy. It stifles other expression. It demeans religion generally, because it comes out with the most outlandish, outrageous statements regarding those who are not Orthodox, or even sometimes those who are Orthodox. You may have seen last week a prominent Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein. His conversions were delegitimated by the chief rabbinate. So Israel is suffering from a context in which religion itself is demeaned by dint of the fact of an Orthodox monopoly.
Very interesting.
And it also drives a wedge between Israel
And the diaspora.
and American Jewry, where deeply committed conservative and reform Jews want a piece of the action and say, we contribute to Israel, we support Israel, but when it comes to questions of personal status and institutional development, the Orthodox have monopoly. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Orthodox monopoly had a lot to do with David Ben-Gurion trying to put together some sort of coalition, and he reached out to Orthodox leadership, and we are dealing with the ramifications of that close to 70 years later.
You've now, both of you, have raised the issue of American Jewry and its relationship to Israel. We are diaspora. The American Jew is in the diaspora. By the way, the Hebrew word is galut. And there is a sense within Israel
That's
that
excellent.
we should one day make Aliyah. All of us should return. And one of the reasons why Israel stands over against American Jewry and is critical is that they see the level of assimilation. And for all the good we've spoken about, and I think the good is just is an ocean of good for the Jewish world because of the Jewish experience in America. At the same time, we all understand it comes with problems. And one of the problems is the extent to which there is assimilation expressed in the extent to which one can now be, without any apology, a secular Jew, a cultural Jew. They're respected. They're part of the Jewish community here. No one says they're not Jewish. And it even extends then to the issue of this society being so open. Jews now regularly date and intermarry non-Jews. So much so that we now are assured, if in fact Hillary and Donald both run, we will have a Jewish son-in-law in the administration.
In the White House, not necessarily.
In the White House, thank you. Obviously through marriage, because both of their children, each child here is married to a non-Jew.
At the Hanukkah Christmas celebration and the Passover Seder, which has now become de rigueur in the White House, due to the presence of an African-American
That's
president.
right.
Okay, so now I'm asking you, talk for a moment about how you feel. And Steve, I want you to begin. What is the challenge of the openness of American society mean for the problem of assimilation in all of its forms, both in terms of cultural assimilation and also in terms of intermarriage and what that does to the sense of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish family?
One of the things we often forget about is that the term heresy actually means choice. In other words, it means people are choosing to incline to one or another forms of theology that are somehow different or off the beaten track, or off the derech, as the Orthodox like to refer to. As long as we're talking about choices, and to me that's, again, the great blessing of America, that it's a matter of choice. People will choose forms of expression that will be very different from what a small number of us may choose, and we may not even be terribly happy about where it's going to go down the road. But the importance of that choice is that because they're making their individual choices, one can respect, admire, in some respects even emulate. What bothers me is when there's no Jewish education, then it's no longer a matter of choice. Then it's no longer a matter of heresy, per se. And again, I use the word heresy in the most positive of terms here. If it's something that one has no choice about, as is often tragically the case when there is no Jewish education, or minimal or poor Jewish education, then American Jewry faces a very bleak future. I mean, in America, if you don't choose to be Jewish, you're going to end up confronting serious problems of identity. I think in terms of where we are today, there's about 20-25% of the community, which is, again, 1.8 million, who are what I would call full-time Jews, meaning the rhythms of leading a Jewish life speak to them on a day-to-day basis. There's another 20% who, frankly, couldn't care less one way or another. And that's a reality of America, and it's a very sad reality, but that's the choice that they've made. The real question is what's going to happen to the great middle, the 50 to 55% who want to see Jewish grandchildren. They want to see this enterprise continue. In some respects, they're really attracted to it in terms of the variety of forms that America offers. But they're not quite sure how to get that done. They're not quite sure how to transmit it. They're not quite sure how to make it into a viable institution or a viable movement. If you ask me where we're headed in the future, my hope is that a larger percentage of that middle will choose to join the core. My fear is that given the reality that America gives you every possible choice, including the choice not to be Jewish, my fear is that we'll be confronting more and more assimilation as the decades go on.
I mean, there's two ways to look at this. One is that assimilation ends up finishing what Hitler started. That's what we don't want to see. But then there's these, what Steve said, the battle for the other 50%. I'm sorry that we had such a baseball theme here of this discussion, but this is another one that Steve will love. Another Yankee game I went to. Who's the name of the third baseman or first baseman who was Jewish for the Red Sox? Who was that guy? Euclid.
John.
I happened to be sitting that time in a much better seat. A friend of mine a Jewish guy in the television industry, they were there for upfronts, so he got tickets in the first 3 or 4 rows. And I end up sitting with Euclid's father. And I happen to know that Euclid is Jewish. Why? Because that's what we know. We know who the Jewish baseball players are. So I turned to him and I said, hello, Mr. Euclid, I understand you're Jewish, I'm Jewish, it's fun sitting next to you for this game. And he proceeds to tell me how Jewish the family is and how many times they went to synagogue, they went to shul. So we're talking, he's very serious. He says, what's Euclid's first name, the kid?
Kevin.
Kevin's a very serious Jew. So I said to him, I said, so when you think about, say, Ryan Braun, right, his father was an Israeli, mother was not Jewish, Euclid's father, I hope he's watching this, turns to me and he says, Ryan Braun never goes to shul. Now there's a message in that. You know, here's a Reform Jew whose son is playing in the major leagues, and for him this matters. He's willing to make the distinction. You know, to him, he's not casual about it. He's saying, Ryan Braun is not Jewish in my mind. He doesn't go to shul. He never had a bar mitzvah. And so it makes me think that you know, I just reviewed a book that Steve knows about for the Washington Post. I don't want to talk about the book, but I want to say that one of its claims, it's a contradictory claim. One of the claims is that, you know, in terms of Jewish support for Israel, it may turn out that it'll be only based on Orthodox support, because Reform Jews feel less strongly about his commitment to Israel than the Orthodox. The good news is that the Orthodox are having more children, and they're becoming more Jewish in their commitment to Judaism.
But that'll be a disaster for U.S.-Israel relations.
That's right. That will be a disaster. And then what you're seeing is, again, the disappearance of the liberal Jew. The liberal Jew just fades away. That's a terrible outcome for many, many reasons. What I want to hope is that Euclid's father's view prevails. He's the one that we're looking for in that 50%, for whom he's a Reform Jew, and it matters to him that his son still goes to shul. And he said, I don't know if there was ever a situation with Kevin Euclid and High Holidays? I don't think so.
He always played.
He always played?
That Hank Greenberg, Sandy Koufax motif is pretty much passé. In other words, it simply doesn't come up every year.
Except for one thing. I forget his last name because we're having a senior moment, but there's a Jewish player for the Dodgers, Sean.
Yeah, Green.
Sean Green.
He didn't
played
eat.
during the
Hang
day.
on,
He would not play at night.
He didn't. He fasted and played.
But the
He
important
did.
point for me was that when Los Angeles Dodgers ownership was asked about Green's conflict, et cetera, and by the way, I think he played on Yom Kippur night and hit a home run, so God obviously let him hit the home run. But
You have more theology in your background than I do.
more importantly, the reaction of the Dodgers ownership was, we don't want to be bothered by this question. It's your choice. It's totally up to you.
Yeah.
So to piggyback on your comment, which is really the salient comment, he's given the choice. He chooses the way he's going to define his Judaism, and he chooses more often than not to play on the holidays. So it isn't the outside world that's forcing him to make
the
difficult,
Tigers.
like Mickey Cochran and the owners back in the 1930s. The problem is with us. And Mark, this has nothing to do with sports. It has to do with decisions in terms of identity, in terms of where you see yourself in terms of American Judaism.
Does the prospect of assimilation bother you?
Of course it bothers me, and I take a bit of a dystopian vision of this, that in fact the arrow is pointing towards that 50% moving away from Judaism, because the outside pressure to remain Jewish is not nearly as powerful as it's less than ever before. And the job of the Jewish community, it's multifaceted Jewish community, and Steve's right on in terms of Jewish education. There's nothing comparable to an intensive, extensive, ongoing education if we have any chance of surviving beyond the rightist Orthodox into the 21st century.
So obviously, I'm not only the only woman here, but I'm probably the only one who's in favor of assimilation. And I see assimilation as a two-way street, which I think is what we've been speaking about, that Jews take things from American society and they give to American society, and that the interchange that occurs there is an ongoing one that has enriched the United States, as we've given many examples of, but has also enriched Jews. It's given Jews pluralism, it's given Jews opportunities to exercise forms of political power. It has had positive effects on Jews. And my approach to the question of assimilation is that one of the things that Jews have been always able to do across time, in the US as well as in other places, has been to take things from the larger society and to Judaize them, to make them into something Jewish when they weren't initially before. And whether you look back on something like, throwing breadcrumbs into the stream, right? At Rosh Hashanah, which was not a Jewish practice. It wasn't originally created by the rabbis. It's something that the people wanted to do. Or you look at more modern things such as a bat mitzvah that we've already mentioned, or egalitarian forms of Jewish religious observance. You see how Jewish creativity works in a lot of different ways. Chabad's success in the United States, it owes something not just to the Salvation Army, but also to JFK's, John F. Kennedy's, Peace Corps movement, which inspired the Lubavitcher Rebbe to set up something locally. So I see assimilation in a very positive way. I see it as a two-way street. I see Judaism as something that's always changing. And as for where the middle will go, I have absolutely no idea. But the fact that someone referred to, conversions of these or these Jewish brother-in-laws is an indication to which elements of being Jewish are attractive to people in the United States, which I think is also relatively new. There was a long time, even after World War II, where Jews were not particularly considered desirable as neighbors, as in any number of different categories. And now they are considered desirable. And that's part of what makes this a really interesting country.
There's a lot of merit to Deborah's comments. The late Gerson Cohen, former chancellor of JTS, did you study with him at all?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
She knows him better than I do, but he wrote a piece about 50 years ago called The Blessings of Assimilation in Jewish History, along the lines more or less of what
That's
Deborah
true.
just said, and by and large, he's absolutely correct. However, I think we need to be a bit more nuanced here, is that there really are in effect two forms of assimilation. Perhaps the term should not be used because we mean different things by it. But one form of assimilation is precisely what Deborah and Gerson Cohen argue is a real rule of Jewish history, that wherever Jews have lived, they've managed to adapt, co-opt, bring on the best of the general culture, including when the general culture was the gymnasium or things that we might otherwise not associate with Judaism, but we've managed to do positive things with them. But there's a second form of assimilation. I think probably the better term here is integration, is that when we stop being Jewish. My colleague, Professor Stephen M. Cohen, argues that the latest Pew study indicates there are 2.1 million individuals today of Jewish background, meaning one parent Jewish, one generation back, who are ex-Jews, who are simply no longer Jews. Cohen argues, I think quite effectively, that's a real tragedy for Jewish history, that we've lost so many people. So I look at, I hear what Deborah says, and I think her argument in principle makes a great deal of sense. The part of the great blessing of America is that we can forge a Judaism that is not locked in the ghetto of previous eras, not locked in the model of previous eras, but can take on some of the best features of America. But we're also observing, if you will, a Judaism in which being a Jew means nothing whatsoever. Or to put into simple terms, if being a Jew does not express something that is distinctive, something that is somehow rather meaningful or different, to what extent is it worthwhile keeping up the entire enterprise?
I think both of you say something that's very, very important. The way you use the word assimilation is very interesting to me. I probably would have called it acculturation. Normally when assimilation is used, it's used about Jews stopping being Jewish altogether. I see nothing good in that. And when you and Steve both talk about education, you understand that's what everybody at this table is about. And that's what JBS is. What I've tried to do here is create an educational tool using the most powerful medium in the world, television, which is now not only seen on flat screen TVs, but it's seen on computers and on smartphones and online. And what we're trying to do is educate, inform, and I hope as well inspire, because I believe what you've defined is the most critical need, and I've heard it since the 1950s, and we have never seen an effective answer. And I'm not saying JBS is the only answer or the most effective answer, but we reach hundreds of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands of people are watching you right now, and they're learning from you. And you will say things that make them think, and they'll have ideas of their own. And that's why I'm so grateful that not only am I able to do this, but that you make the effort, and I realize it's an effort for all four of you to come out here and sit with me. We really are almost out of time. I'm going to say a couple of quick things, and I want your reaction. When I think about America in its best sense, certain photographs come to mind. I want to tell you my photographs. You either respond to them or give me a photograph of your own. I see the photograph of Harry S. Truman standing with Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann convinces Truman to support the establishment of the State of Israel. I see the picture of Arthur Lelyveld with his head cracked open in part of the civil rights movement, and I see the iconic picture of Abraham and Joshua Heschel shoulder to shoulder with Martin Luther King. And for me, those three pictures are from Mark Golub, iconic about what the Jewish experience has been, and it says so much to me about the values and the extent to which, as Heschel says, you pray with your feet. You're part of the experience to make this a better world and this a better country, and Americans have taken the best of American values, and Yitzhak Greenberg talks about that all the time, and how that is part of the open modern Orthodoxy, and Avi Weiss talks about it. For me, those are images that express what I love about America, as well as the particularistic pictures of what is Shabbat, what's Havdalah in front of the Lincoln Memorial. That's that's a video I did of a group of kids doing Havdalah in the early night, evening hours in front of the Lincoln Memorial. That says so much to me about what America and being Jewish in America is. Those are some of my images. Do you have any images you would share?
I have one.
Please.
In the summer of 1972, when the entire Israeli Olympic team was massacred by Palestinian terrorists, a week before that, a Jewish boy from Los Angeles won 7 gold medals. And there was Mark Spitz on the victor stand wearing a red, white, and blue Speedo, as American as you could be, and flashing a telegenic California smile and a mustache, on his way to being on a Wheaties box. And those images of the botched rescue attempt in Munich to save those athletes, and Spitz was shuttled out of Munich instantly once this happened. Apparently, there were other Jewish athletes from around the world that were shuttled immediately out of the Olympics.
But the games went on.
The games went on, tragically.
Tragically.
And I can't think of anything more jarring, within weeks of each other. But it also yet represented another example
That's
of
a very lovely image.
an achievement of American assimilation.
Good for you.
So I have an image.
Please.
And if you can reproduce it
We'll
for people
try.
to see, that would be great. It's a photograph by Louis Hine, who's a photographer, not Jewish, from Wisconsin, who comes to teach at the Ethical Culture School. That was one of those pluralistic Jewish institutions in New York. And he goes to Ellis Island to take pictures of immigrants. And this is a photograph of a young woman, and it's called Russian Jewess. And it's framed in the back by those windows that existed, and it still exists in Ellis Island. So she's backlit, and she's filled with promise.
That's
and hope.
lovely. That is fabulous. It reminds me, by the way, of Emma Lazarus's words that end up on the Statue of Liberty, and that is also a Jewish contribution etched in stone forever in America. Any other one?
Well, mine is from a sport we haven't spoken about at all, football. There are two images that have to be put back together, juxtaposed one with another. As you can imagine, I'm a New England Patriots fan. So I watch Monday Night Football, and there's this year, Ezra Schwartz, a native of Boston, was killed in a terrorist action. And I'm happy to be out to dinner with some friends, and I knew the football game was in the background. But when they announced that there's a special ceremony in his memory, I said, this is America. This is the greatness of America. At the same time, this is on the more humorous side, but I think it also speaks volumes. Early 1970s, Monday Night Football was obviously at its height with Howard Cosell and his partners, Don Meredith. The holidays that year were all Monday and Tuesday, which meant that, like, for 4 weeks in a row, there's there's a reason you can't watch, whatever that is. along comes the next game, and one of the players gets injured, but he continued playing. So Cosell comments, so-and-so seems to be revealing the effects of his leg injury, and that is a matter of res gestae, as we lawyers like to say, meaning it's a relevant matter. Meredith shot back by saying, Howard, is that another one of your Jewish holidays? Then asked him, what was the one last week? He said, Shmini Atzeret. I said, only in America.
Only in America.
So my image you'll have to create for me is not about sports. It's about food, about kitchens. What I have in mind is the great tossed salad, one of the metaphors of before there was a Louis Brandeis, there was a Horace Callan, who argued the greatness of America, fighting against the Madison Grants and the assimilationists, the real assimilationists, and the melting potters. The greatness of America lies in not the homogeneity of its people, but the heterogeneity of its people. And since I know nothing about music, I can't talk about the American Symphony, but since I like tossed salad, I'll say tossed salad. But that idea of cultural pluralism has been one of the great debates which is ongoing to this very day. Unfortunately, we're not the objects of that debate. But presently, as we speak, this question of what constitutes America, what constitutes the ideal American, is still in play 100 years after Callan spoke these words. So that's the image. So create a salad for
I will create
for
a
the
salad,
five of us.
And since you raised the issue, American Jews are always worried that they will be charged with a dual loyalty. To what extent is that something that we really did have to deal with in the past, which we should worry about in the present? And it has to do, again, with this notion of galut and the Israeli saying to the American, you know, the American still is plagued with a galut mentality, that there is something still happening to the American Jew where the Jew is still a little afraid to be too outspoken, a little afraid if he wants to remain the court Jew, and that there are still American Jews who sometimes are critical of Israel because somehow they feel it is hurting them in the eyes of their non-Jewish friends, or maybe something bad will happen in America because there'll be a backlash against Israel. And, you know, this is also part of the American Jewish experience. Do you or anybody else have any comment on that?
My only comment on that is I could spend an hour documenting different instances, but I believe it is more an internal Jewish psychological dynamic than a reality in American life. And I'll just offer one example, and that is prior to the rise of the State of Israel, the United States Congress did a number of investigations as to the American position on Zionism, the mandate, and the prospect of a Jewish state. And everybody showed up. Everybody showed up. Pro-Arab, pro-Palestine, which was talking about Israel, variety of Jewish groups. The only people who really raised the specter of dual loyalty were Jews who were antagonistic to Zionism. Arabs, or supporters of Arab cause, promoted the Arab cause. They didn't implicate American Jews in that dynamic. So I believe, historically speaking, it's more a Jewish malaise than a reality that's really out there that we have to deal with.
Brilliant.
The day the Monica Lewinsky affair broke, we had Frank Rich addressing us on another subject. Frank Rich was at the time the culture commentator for the New York Times and an identified Jew. And because the affair just broke, he was addressing us a totally different subject, but he couldn't resist. He said, I just spoke to the Times newsroom. They are petrified there about a Jewish woman embarrassing the President of the United States. 6 months later, I went to an AJC staff meeting, and I reminded everyone what Richard said. And I said, we've had 24 hours of all Monica news all day long for 6 months. Does anyone here care about the fact that she's Jewish? One colleague said, yes. The Arab press is having a field day that they think it's a Zionist plot. In other words, America did not regard the Monica affair as a Jewish matter of any sort. But Jews had constructed themselves that kind of internal fear.
What you said.
Exactly. I just go one step further, though, and say that where the Israelis are right is in the sense that there are times when our fear is so great that we become unfair to ourselves. Henry Kissinger, hardly the greatest spokesman for the Jewish cause ever, But he wrote a piece back in the early 1970s in which he said American Jews, like other Americans, have multiple loyalties. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's an asset. And that goes back to Brandeis and Callan, as was mentioned earlier. Somehow or other, we are so proud of Jews who have made it in American society. When those same people turn to internal Jewish causes, we fear a backlash. The message really should be to your listeners and to everyone we encounter, the greatness of America is that there has been no backlash. I mentioned the Rosenberg case earlier. As far as I'm concerned, Rosenbergs were likely as guilty as all hell. But the real story is that notwithstanding the real fears of American Jews, American society reacted with incredible fairness and said the Rosenbergs were what they were. Guilty as charged. The American Jewish community is not. We went over backward advocating for capital punishment for the Rosenbergs, which again, obviously it depends upon how you feel about capital punishment, but even J. Edgar Hoover argued that Ethel Rosenberg did not deserve capital punishment.
So I asked the four of you to come with one or two individuals who you feel have made, as Jews, the most significant contribution, not to Jewish life in America, but to American life. And you would say?
I would say Irving Berlin, because he wrote God Bless America, and he wrote all the signature songs that many people, societies are oftentimes defined by the songs they sing. And he wrote the American Songbook. It's what really joins us, the songs that are all recognizable to us. We can hum them. We know
Name
the
some
tunes.
of them.
Of his?
Yeah.
I'll Be Loving You Always, Blue Skies. What's the song that says, I hate to get up in the morning? The Bugle Boy song, right?
But he did write
White Christmas, Easter Parade. It's an endless.
And God Bless America.
And of course, most especially, he wrote God Bless America. So, we have two anthems. We have Francis Scott Key.
What's interesting to me is that you, an author, didn't pick an author.
Well, that's because I'm not as sanguine about literary culture.
Interesting.
I know that I've published 5 novels. I don't know how many people read them. And I know even among bestsellers, I don't know how many people read bestsellers, but everybody sings God Bless America.
Everyone should read your novels.
Well, thank you.
Everyone. Okay, Deborah?
I would nominate Ruth Bader Ginsburg as the first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court, as someone who I see as having changed American society, opening up opportunities for women that would allow them to be more equal, for her stances in regard to very important issues from abortion to equity in pay to a whole range of things.
Fascinating.
So I'll stick first with Jonas Salk.
I love it.
I'll add one other name.
Please.
And Steve can help me with this. He was the owner of Malden Mills in Massachusetts.
Aaron Feuerstein.
Aaron Feuerstein,
Right.
who, when his mill burnt down before the Christmas holiday, must be 20 years ago,
Yeah.
he made sure that all of his workers were paid and had a good Christmas. And the story is told that when he walked into restaurants in Boston, people stood up and gave him a standing ovation. It was played out throughout the media, throughout this country. He made an extraordinary contribution to the way we as Jews are seen by the outside world. So he's number 1 and number 2 on my list.
Fascinating. Okay, so
2 very different kinds of nominations. One is, we have spoken about popular culture. Steven Spielberg has transformed, revolutionized. He's led the entire generation of Hollywood, I think, in very positive directions. So I certainly put him at the very top of that list. The other narrative gives me a sort of an opportunity. It gives us a chance, number one, to talk about another trend that we haven't focused on. Also gives me a chance to pay tribute to my two historian colleagues. As far back as 1965 or so, you found academic Jewish studies at Harvard, Columbia, Brandeis, UCLA, and a couple points in between. Today, there's not a university of note that doesn't have an impressive program of academic Jewish studies, and my 2 colleagues here stand at the very helm of 2 of the most important. The 2 individuals who legitimated Judaic studies for the university, which is one of the great success narratives of the second half of the 20th century, are Sela Baron at Columbia and Harry Wolfson at Harvard. We stand in effect in their shadow. Sela So I would say that in terms of making a major contribution to America, what they did is they brought the study of Judaism into higher American civilization, or the university culture of America, and for that we should be in their debt.
What a joy this has been, and I can't thank you enough. You brought intelligence, you brought wit. It's just, I could sit with you for hours and hours, and I can't thank you enough. And I'm just telling you what the audience would tell you if they could see you and touch you and kiss you and hug you. But it's been an honor to have you on. I love you so much, my dear friend.
Anything
And
for you, Mark?
You're always at my side.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Four fabulous, fabulous people. There you have it. The thoughts of Jeffrey Gurock and Thane Rosenbaum and Deborah Dash Moore and Stephen Bayme. I hope you've enjoyed hearing their observations and their feelings about Jewish life in the United States of America on this holiday weekend. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any comments in response to anything they've said, or you may have some ideas of your own about what this Jewish experience has been in the extraordinary United States of America. So please, as always, email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I love hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.